We're going to talk about sharecropping today, which is going to be the main job freedmen end up working in after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, well, before the Civil War, most African Americans were slaves and they were working on farms in the fields. Slavery is illegal, so white Southerners come up with a system that's going to imitate or replicate slavery as much as possible, but not be a violation of the 13th Amendment. So sharecropping, by definition, a sharecropper is a landless farmer, which is kind of a conflicting statement because the one thing a farmer needs is land. So let's take a look at how it worked. One thing with sharecropping is it wasn't just for freedmen. There were some poor whites in the South that ended up being sharecroppers. So there were two parties involved, the person that owned the land and the sharecropper. And they each had different responsibilities. The landowner would be responsible for the following things: providing the land, providing the seed, the equipment, and the selling of crops. This is going to end up being very, very important right here. But these were their obligations. The sharecropper, on the other hand, was the labor. They would plant the seed, they would maintain the crops, they would harvest the crops in the fall. So we see two different groups. Each group is needed. If the landowner doesn't provide these things, we're not going to get a crop. And if the sharecropper doesn't provide the labor, then we're not going to get a crop to sell. So the way it worked, well, in theory, after the crop was harvested, so let's say we're growing cotton, after the crop was harvested, the landowner and the sharecropper would split the money, the profits. Okay. This depended. Sometimes it might be a 50-50 split. Other times the landowner might receive a higher percentage, maybe 60-40, 70-30, but this was negotiated up front. So in theory, this is how it was supposed to work. Just on a side note, a lot of times the sharecroppers would continue to live in the shacks or shelters that the former slaves lived in. This was especially true on the larger farms that used to be plantations. Before the crop was harvested and there was money to be split, the landowner would loan money to the sharecropper for basic expenses such as food, clothing, and shelter. It would be expected that the sharecropper would pay the money back at harvest time. Here's the deal. One thing that's unique about farming is you only get paid once a year. You only get paid when the cotton or whatever crop you're growing is sold. So that's usually in the fall. This whole thing starts in the spring when we begin to plant. And the sharecroppers wouldn't have any money because they're former slaves. They're freedmen now. So the landowner would loan them money for the next, I don't know, let's say they plant the crop in March. I don't know when cotton's planted, doesn't matter. And 6 months later, it's ready to be picked. So that's 6 months that the sharecropper, they need a place to stay, they need clothing, they need shelter if they have to see a doctor. So the landowner would lend them that money. Then when it was time to sell, let's say we split it 50-50, then the freedmen, the sharecropper, would get their money, but you would minus whatever amount they borrowed back in March. It says when harvest time arrived and the money was to be split, the landowner would give the sharecroppers little or sometimes no money, stating that the sharecropper owed him money from the living and food expenses. In many cases, the sharecropper would receive no money or be in debt to the landowner, forcing the sharecropper to work off the debt. So let's say I'm the landowner, you're the sharecropper, and we go out and grow 50 acres of cotton. And it comes time to sell it. I take it to market, I sell it, and we get $100. And we agreed to in March that we were going to split it 50-50. So I'm supposed to receive $50, you're supposed to receive $50. So I get back from selling it, and I tell you, well, we made $100, so we each get $50, but you owe me $50 because I provided your food, clothing, and shelter for the last 6 months. So if we do some simple math on this, you made $50, but we deduct the expenses, you come out at zero. And when we stop and really think about this isn't much different than slavery, because when freedmen were slaves, the slave owner was providing with food, clothing, and shelter. Another thing I could do is I could lie about it. So let's say we made $100, but I go off to sell it. I come back and I say, well, we only made $80. So we each get $40, but you owe me $50. So now you're in debt to me $10. And the way it worked back then, they would write laws. So if you were in debt to someone, you were required to work for them until that debt was paid off. So what I can do with this, the landowner, is year after year, I can put you further and further in debt, and legally, you have to continue to work for me. Okay? I'm not going to read through all this. This is kind of what I just explained. And I explained that. So the outcome of this is sharecropping was not that much different than slavery for many freedmen living in the South. Freedmen were forced to work and live on Southern farms, receiving little or no money. And you might say, well, the freedmen did have a choice in the beginning. They didn't have to work for the landowner. But at this time, what are their other options? They don't have money to travel really anywhere else to find another job. We saw in some states there were black codes that said you had to have a license to work in any other job. So they're kind of stuck to a certain extent. And then after a year, they don't make any money, so they still can't leave, or they're in debt, so legally they're forced to stay there. This map is showing you the percentage of farms sharecropped by county. And anywhere you see this blue, that's 35 to 80%, which I get is a pretty big margin there. But these are the places where cotton could be grown the best. And I added the sharecropper would be in debt to the landowner, and they would fall into this cycle of poverty that would continue for years and years and years. This is what's really scary right here. So slavery ends in 1865, 1866. Sharecropping continued to last until the 1940s and 50s. So for another 80, 90 years, you're going to find people in the South that are working in these conditions. The thing that finally ended sharecropping, it wasn't a law. It wasn't people got sick of it. It was actually machinery. Once someone invented a tractor or a combine, I don't know what you call this, that actually